So there was this young boy, and this young boy loved snakes. He was obsessed with snakes. And this actually started because his father collects snakes, and he actually has his own business. He runs out of his house where he would collect snakes, he would breed them, and he would sell them. Now, one day, as this boy went to his father, because usually his father has no problem. He's like, you can go and play with the snakes. Just make sure you put them back. Make sure you lock all the cages. So one day this boy, he wants to go and he wants to play with the snakes a little bit. Usually the father has no problem at all. But this time when he goes to his father says, no. And it's like, why? And the father's like, I got a new snake and I'm not sure what kind it is, so I have to make sure that it's not venomous. So at first, the boy is like, I really want to go, but I can understand that. My dad's trying to protect me. So the boy starts walking towards his room. And his room, to walk towards his room, he has to walk by where all the snakes are. And as he walked by where the snakes are, he just happened to turn his head. He was hoping he might see the new snake at least if he can't play with it. And he happened to see a very colorful snake, and it caught his eye. So he looked around, and his dad wasn't there. So he snuck in, very quietly closed the door, and he went over to that cage. Now this snake, it had this pattern. It was like red and black. It was his favorite colors. And he was like, man, I just have to touch this snake. I just have to, one touch won't hurt. So he opens up the cage and the snake comes back like it's in striking position. But remember, he's used to snakes and he knows all snakes to do this. So he puts his hand in there. The snake strikes him. And immediately he pulls his hands out and runs out the room. And then his dad, later on that day, goes in his room to get him for dinner. And he's laying there dead. So you see, the dad gave him that commandment that usually and originally the son was going to obey it. But when he got that commandment, when that snake caught his eye and it aroused his desire, he went in. He risked his life and ended up losing his life. And that's kind of what's going on in our text today. So remember, Paul has been talking about the law. He said the Christian, yes, he's been united with Christ. He's died with him and raised with Christ. The Christian has become freed from the law, become a slave of righteousness to his loving master who sent Jesus Christ to save his soul. The Christian has put his faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. But it's like now for the Christian to obey, he must not just go back to the law. Because the law, remember, is going to stir up his sin because you and I still have sin in us and the law will only stir up our sin. So how do we obey God? Well, it's not by going back and saying, I will keep the law. Because we're not under law. We have to serve him under grace or under the newness of the Spirit, which we'll discuss a little bit later. Okay, so now in verse 8, look at the last phrase in verse 8. Paul says, for apart from the law, sin was dead. I was once alive without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the commandment, which was to bring life, I found to bring death. So Paul, remember, he has been saying, look, the law is not a bad thing, but when it comes to me, it arouses my desires. And that's just like our illustration. Remember, the dad, the father, gave his son his commandment because he loved his son, to preserve his son's life. The commandment was to bring life, to preserve the life of his son. But rather, what happened? The commandment actually led to the death of his son. I mean, perhaps if the father never said anything, the son wouldn't have even cared to look in there. Because he's actually a very obedient son. He wouldn't even care to look and see if he might see what the new snake was. But because he got that commandment, now his desires were aroused. So he couldn't just walk by the room. He had to look in and try to see if he could see the new snake. And once he saw it, the desire was aroused all the more because it was his favorite colors. And you know how the story went. And that's what's going on here. Again, Paul says, verse 8 last, for apart from the law, sin was dead. See, if the boy never got that commandment, he could have walked by that room. Like I said, he's a very obedient. But when he got that law, his desires were aroused. See, if he didn't get that, his desires would have been dead, so to speak. But once he got that, his desires were aroused. So when he tried to walk by that room, he had to look. Now notice in verse 9, he says, I was once alive without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. Again, when the Father gave him that commandment, his desires were aroused in him. He didn't want to disobey, but now he had a desire. Oh, what's this snake he's talking about? I have to see this snake. So you see, sin revived and it led to his death. And Paul, he says in verse 10, and the commandment, which was to bring life. See, the Father gave the Son this commandment because he wanted to preserve his son's life. He loved his son. He wanted to protect his son. He wasn't positive that it was poisonous, but he wasn't positive it wasn't. He wanted to preserve the life of his son. So he told his son, he gave his son this commandment. When usually he would let his son go play with the snakes, he wanted to protect his son this time. So he gave him that commandment. And as Paul says, and the commandment which was to bring life, I found to bring death. So the good commandment, the loving commandment of the Father to protect and preserve the life of his son actually led to the death of his son. Now, what are we to say? Well, when the son went and asked the father should have said, well, go ahead. I mean, what was the father to do? He loved the son. He wanted to protect the son. He wanted to preserve the son's life. But that good commandment led to the death of the son. And that's what's true about all of us. Even if we're Christians, we put our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ because we have sinful desires in us. When we go to the law and we hear the commandment, it arouses our evil desires. It may not be the same desire in everyone, but everyone has a desire for something that God forbids, or a desire not to do something that God says do. But anyway, we all have sinful desires and they're aroused when the commandment comes to us. So therefore, we can't just go to the commandment and say, now I'm a Christian, I'm going to go to the commandment and I'm going to keep the commandment. That's not going to work because they will stir up our sinful desires. So what do? As I said, we serve in the newness of the Spirit. We've talked about this. What does that mean? Well, back in chapter 5, it says the Spirit pours out the love of God in our heart. Then he gives an explanation of the gospel, telling us that the love of God is poured out in our heart by diving deeper into the gospel. So Christian, let me challenge you. For your obedience to Christ, to God, do not go back to the law. Do not go back to the letter. It's not a bad thing, but you have something bad in you and it's called sin. I have something bad in me. It's called sin. So what do? We go deeper and deeper into the gospel. Remember, we love him because he first loved us. If we're to grow in our love for Christ and therefore loving him, we serve him all the more. If we're to grow in that, then we must go deeper in the gospel because we have sinful desires. And the only thing that can break a desire is a greater desire. So when we go and we see the love of God, see the love of Christ, have a greater desire to love and serve Christ, then our sinful desires won't be as powerful. This is how we obey him. So Christian, don't go to the commandment. It's not going to help you. It may even lead to your death, like that young man. Not your eternal death, but it could lead to your harm. Go to the gospel. Go to Christ. Know him more. Love him more. And this is how we serve him.